Hi everyone, this is our second presentation on industrialization and imperialism 1750 to 1914. And if you recall, last time we were discussing how industry changed inside of Great Britain, especially England, and how those changes not only changed how people worked and made money, but also how they lived. Remember, we had industry pulled people. When we talk about pull factors in migration, pulled people into the cities for jobs and, in some ways, better quality of life. And you also had push factors, where out of the countryside, peasants and who used to be serfs were being pushed out of the manors that were held by the nobility because, well, the nobility found better means to make money. So if you recall, industry also came the time of mercantilism. And with mercantilism is the idea that there's a finite amount of wealth throughout the world. So you have an initiative for the acquisition of land, people, and goods. But also, industry needs to have, it needs to be fueled. It needs to be fueled by raw materials. So Europe, which now needs these raw materials, and they need new markets in order to sell finished goods at, are going to start branching out further throughout the rest of the world to acquire whatever they feel like they can. New technology and warfare increased national and imperialistic power. And this is something that you see time and time again throughout history. Whereas if one nation comes and it has technological superiority, it usually overpowers the new people they come across and controls them. And we're going to see that this is one advantage that Europeans are going to have thanks to industry and the scientific revolution. Nationalism fueled by competitive atmosphere between countries to gain land. We're going to see land grabs left and right. Of course, England is going to have the most skin in the game. They're going to have the jump start due to their acquisition of course, India, Australia, and much of North America, and also because they're a very powerful naval force. And of course, their advances in industry. And other nations are going to try to catch up. So, the Berlin Conference of 1884. Now, the Berlin Conference was mostly about European powers trying to settle which European power had imperialistic holdings in what part of the world, specifically Africa. Germany is going to come up as a new nation, and following the Napoleonic Wars, if you recall, where Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated, the ancient regimes, the old powers of Europe, are going to get together, and they're going to make agreements on who owns what and who may go where. Germany didn't exist as a nation yet, so they weren't in those agreements. Now that Germany is this big, new, powerful, scary force, Europeans don't know what to do about that. And Germany wants to be an imperialistic power like the rest of them. So this is going to throw things off balance. Christian missionaries come to spread the gospel throughout the world. So if you remember all the way back, possibly in first grade, you learned about your 3 G's. Gold, God, and glory. And so we have the gold with industry. People are wanting raw supplies, specie, precious metals, gems, and spices, and of course markets and all those good things. And now you have the gods. So you have people from different denominations. Remember, this is definitely post-Reformation and counter-Reformation. So you have different churches vying to spread Christianity throughout the world. And of course, glory, we discussed that as well, because, well, nations wanted to be their own imperial powers. All right, so another ideology that's going to start coming around the late 19th century is social Darwinism. This is going to spread a sense of racial superiority and inferiority. It's not to say that racism didn't exist before this, but this is when we start having terms such as scientific racism. You're going to have what today we regard as false sciences, such as phrenology, the studying of skull shapes to determine intelligence and heredity. And a lot of this is going to go in all kinds of different directions. We're going to see the ghost of this crop up in World War II, of course. People are generally aware of the Nazis and Hitler's idea as far as racial superiority and things like that. This is going to be used to, social Darwinism is going to be used to also promote anti-Semitism, Jim Crow laws in the South, the growth of industry between winners and losers, where some are meant to win and some are meant to lose. But get into that later. Okay, so the Berlin Conference of 1884 helped establish a lot of boundaries for the European powers in Africa. Those boundaries were not stable. However, you can see here from the colonies of 1914, around the era of World War I, and the current countries there today, they're very similar. So what that tells you is that these countries were essentially had their borders made by Europeans, not the locals. And some of the problems with that, of course, is now all of a sudden you have people who might have been not friendly with one another, not speak the same language or have the same culture, all of a sudden part of the same country. You see this all throughout the Middle East, and of course Africa and other parts of the world. And so some historians say that that's why there's so much violence in parts of Africa today, is you have a lot of people who don't want to live with each other, have to live with each other. And so sometimes things turn violent. European imperialism effects. Europeans dominated the politics, economics, and much of the culture in most of Africa and Asia. And of course there were different colonial methods that were used. Say England was very good at setting up puppet princes or puppet governments that would do what they wanted to, but looked good to many of the locals. The French, on the other hand, tended to have a very controlling aspect. They would install their own governments. They would force their colonies to learn their language and change their culture and things like that. Countries and political boundaries were created in many countries by Europe despite the locals' history or differences, as we mentioned before. Colonies are often stripped of natural resources. We see that that was a major problem for these people. They did not have manufacturing. They often did not have schools made. They were just there to have their goods stripped from them. Belgian Congo is one of the most horrific examples of this, where people were forced in very brutal labor camps to work themselves to death to extract the Congo of its own natural resources to give to essentially the King of Belgium. Europeans often fought in their colonies. So we see here Opium Wars, where Great Britain forced China to accept their trade of opium and essentially cause a major drug addiction pandemic within China. The Boer War, this has to do with African colonies, and the Boxer Rebellion. This is when you had essentially a political and a religious movement within China try to overthrow Western imperialism, but that was quickly put down due to superior technology. When colonized countries do gain independence, they are often unstable. We still see that today. Especially throughout Africa and in parts of South America and other parts of the world. They still also only rely on their natural resources so often. We call that the extraction industries, where they're simply selling oil, coal, metals, and things of that nature. All right, imperialism effects continue. Colonies gained infrastructural improvements such as railroads and telegraph lines. So we do see that technology is introduced. Of course, railroads, not only for transportation, but also for extraction and for opening up markets. Telegraph lines, communication is very key to reach those imperialistic governments abroad. Imperial forces often kept peace in their colonies. Now, you can debate upon methods and outcomes, but generally speaking, wars did not happen without the imperial powers' permission. Humanitarian efforts provided medicine, improved infrastructure, increased life expectancy, and spread education throughout many colonies. So yes, we are going to see some day-to-day improvements for some people. And so that's, I mean, it does bring about modernization. Having railroads, telegraph lines, having some schools open up in many places. European technology and forms of government spread throughout the world, bringing modernity to more people. So some places are going to start adopting, like I said, political movements, education, more of a democratic element, the idea of human rights. So these things are going to start spreading, of course, with the colonies, throughout the colonies. Well, folks, I think we're going to end with our lecture here today, and we will pick up more on imperialism and industrialization next time. Thank you.